They say leadership is forged in the fire of chaos, but no one could have predicted that in the most critical moment aboard the Polaris command vessel, when the Admiral's orders left even the most seasoned officers paralyzed, salvation would come from the one person no one had ever saluted. When a decorated naval fleet teetered on the edge of international disaster during a top-secret joint operation, it wasn't a high-ranking strategist or elite operative who turned the tide. It was a cafeteria worker named Jonah Sorell, whose name no one had even bothered to memorize. What happened that day didn't just change the fate of the mission, it shattered decades of military hierarchy and redefined what it meant to lead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jonah Sorell had always kept to the edges. Tall and lean, with a mop of graying curls often hidden under a hairnet, he walked with the quiet cadence of someone used to being overlooked. He clocked in before sunrise each morning, hauling crates of produce and vacuum-sealed meats into the Polaris kitchen, tucked far below deck near the engine rooms. He wore his name stitched into his sleeve, but rarely did anyone look close enough to read it. In a world where uniforms displayed bars and medals, Jonah's attire was plain, often smudged with sauce or oil, and utterly forgettable. He didn't mind. Or at least, that's what he told himself on long nights, when the silence in his bunk felt heavier than the steel walls around him. The Polaris was the pride of the Coalition Navy, a marvel of modern engineering and geopolitical collaboration. It housed crews from 12 nations, a floating microcosm of discipline, precision, and technological prowess. It was also, unbeknownst to most of its crew, heading into dangerous waters, both literally and politically. Jonah wasn't privy to the mission briefings or high-level protocols. But he was observant. He noticed when supply requests shifted subtly, when shipments of medical kits doubled, or when the normally easy chatter in the mess hall gave way to hushed conversations and furrowed brows. He noticed how Rear Admiral Sterling, a man known for his cold efficiency, had started visiting the command deck more frequently, and how his shoulders seemed stiffer each day. Jonah had served the fleet for almost 20 years, though not in the way most did. He began as a land-based contractor, preparing meals at a naval outpost before transferring onto ships. He never spoke much about his past, and few asked. But there were signs, if anyone had looked closely. The precision with which he organized storage units, the way he could calculate rations in his head, the muscle memory with which he adjusted a pressure valve or checked a bulkhead for leaks, it all hinted at something more, something forgotten or intentionally buried. On the day everything changed, the Polaris had just entered disputed waters. The official line was that they were conducting joint training exercises, but tension in the region had been mounting for months. Jonah had been slicing onions in the prep station when the emergency alarms blared, followed by a voice over the comms ordering all non-essential personnel to secure quarters. He paused, knife still in hand, heart beating with a strange familiarity he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, something closer to readiness. As Jonah moved to comply, he passed through a corridor, lined with junior officers rushing toward their posts. A few brushed past him without a word, eyes locked ahead. He kept walking but slower, letting his ears catch fragments of conversation from the open communication panels that lined the hallway. Scrambled orders. Conflicting coordinates. Confusion layered with urgency. And then, Admiral Sterling's voice, clipped and commanding, calling for an immediate Class 7 maneuver protocol. Silence followed his command, not because it was understood, but because no one knew what to do. The order was outdated, archaic even, retired decades ago from formal training due to its complexity and the risks involved. It was the kind of directive only veterans of a forgotten war might recall. But Sterling had shouted it with conviction, and now no one dared to admit they didn't know what he meant. Jonah stopped walking. His fingers curled at his side. Something about the Admiral's voice stirred a memory he thought had long faded. A briefing room in the early 90s, a chalkboard filled with diagrams, a debate over the ethical implications of such a maneuver. He shook his head. It couldn't be. Not after all this time. But as he turned to head to his quarters, he caught sight of a group of officers frozen at a junction, eyes wide, waiting for someone else to move first. A strange feeling settled in Jonah's chest. Not anxiety, not fear, but responsibility. That's when he changed direction. Instead of returning to his assigned area, he took a detour to the auxiliary navigation room, one he knew few ever used, but that still connected to the central systems. The corridors were quieter there, and he passed no one as he keyed in the access code from memory. The keypad blinked green. The door hissed open. Inside, the systems were on standby, and dust had begun to gather on some of the panels. Jonah stepped forward, activated the consoles, and began inputting commands he hadn't touched in decades. The old maneuver protocol came back to him, not just the steps, but the reasoning, the fail-safes, the emergency override conditions. He remembered because he had been one of the few who helped design it back when he was still part of a covert tactical response team, a lifetime ago, before he walked away from it all and took refuge in the quiet rhythms of cooking. But now the quiet had ended. The Admiral had shouted an order no one could follow, no one but Jonah, and Jonah had just stepped forward. Jonah Sorell never craved attention, and that might have been the only reason he lasted so long on the Polaris without becoming a curiosity. In a place where every movement was logged, every minute accounted for, and every promotion chased like a trophy, Jonah existed as the quiet exception. He moved through his routines like a whisper, invisible unless you needed your coffee refilled or had dietary restrictions to discuss. No one asked where he was from or what led him to spend years of his life on a rotating assignment in the galley of an international naval command vessel. He preferred it that way. The fewer eyes on him, the fewer questions, and fewer questions meant fewer lies. He had a small bunk tucked behind the kitchen's storage bay, just down the hall from the refrigerated units, where produce was kept in pristine condition. The room was barely wider than his outstretched arms, and smelled faintly of cinnamon and bleach, but it was his space, untouched, undisturbed. The wall above his cot bore no decorations, save for a photo taped behind a metal panel, a younger Jonah, arms wrapped around two other figures in standard military-issue uniforms, all of them grinning, despite the grainy quality of the picture. The photo wasn't visible unless you knew where to look, not that anyone ever did. Each morning Jonah rose before reveille. He'd shower, shave, and dress before the rest of the crew even stirred. The kitchen needed to be spotless. Supplies needed accounting. Timers had to be set. He could cook blindfolded if it came to that, and some days, it felt like he did. The job didn't challenge him anymore, not in the way he once knew challenge. But he didn't want challenge. He wanted routine, predictability, silence. He had seen what came from chaos, and the cost it exacted. In those early, bleary hours, before breakfast was served and the clatter of trays filled the space, he allowed himself a few minutes to simply breathe. It wasn't that Jonah was apathetic. On the contrary, he cared deeply about his work. He was meticulous. He knew which crew members had allergies, who preferred decaf, who always skipped lunch but returned for a double helping at dinner. He remembered birthdays, even when no one else did, and left surprise cupcakes or hand-scribbled notes behind canisters. But these gestures were always unsigned, always anonymous. The younger recruits suspected a senior staff member or morale officer. Jonah never corrected them. In his downtime, Jonah read, mostly nonfiction, historical case studies, naval engineering manuals, procedural audits. He kept a worn journal filled with notes, equations, maps he redrew from memory, diagrams of tactical formations, long removed from active protocol. No one asked him about it, because no one saw it. He hid the notebook behind the third drawer in the dry goods cabinet, beneath a false bottom he'd fashioned from an old cutting board. Years aboard ships taught him how to hide things, especially pieces of himself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The few who did take notice of Jonah often dismissed him as a lifer who'd lost his spark, a harmless relic. There were whispers, especially among newer staff, that he might have once held a different post, maybe even officer rank, but no one ever confirmed it. His personnel file was nondescript, purposefully vague, sanitized by bureaucracy, kitchen technician, civilian support staff, non-combat designation. No commendations, no reprimands, just there, like a fixture bolted into the hull. But Jonah hadn't always been just a cook. Years before, he'd been something else entirely, something buried beneath layers of classified clearance and redacted history. The man who now stirred soups and refilled napkin dispensers had once stood in operations centers delivering field analysis to decision-makers who held the fate of nations in their hands. He had led briefings where the slightest miscalculation could trigger airstrikes. He had solved logistical bottlenecks mid-conflict that no algorithm could. And once, just once, he had made a call that cost lives. Lives he still carried. That call, and the fallout that followed, led to his disappearance from the chain of command. He'd filed for civilian reassignment under emergency mental health exemption, a rare protocol granted after prolonged high-risk service. His request had been granted without resistance. It was easier for everyone if he vanished quietly. And so, he did. Into the kitchens, into obscurity, into silence. The Polaris was not the first vessel he'd worked on, but it was the one he had stayed on the longest. Something about it kept him anchored, even when everything inside him urged drift. Perhaps it was the multinational nature of the crew, the constant shuffling of assignments, the fact that people came and went so often that no one noticed who stayed. Or maybe it was because, deep down, he sensed the storm on the horizon. Despite his withdrawal from strategy, Jonah still paid attention. He listened. Not just with his ears, but with the keen observational awareness of a man who once made life-or-death decisions based on the subtlest shifts in tone, posture, silence. And lately, everything had changed. The cadence of meetings, the way seasoned officers carried themselves, the timing of drills, and the vague, non-committal answers when crew asked questions. Jonah didn't need an official debrief to know when the atmosphere changed. He could smell tension like he could smell burning oil before a fire. But no one asked him. No one suspected that beneath the placid, oil-stained apron stood a man with a mind that once helped engineer containment strategies for the most volatile standoffs in modern history. That was fine with him. He had long since accepted his role as an invisible thread in the massive fabric of the fleet. His time had passed. He had made peace with it. Or so he told himself. Until that morning, until the alarm, until the order no one understood. And until, after all the years of silence, Jonah Sorell finally stepped forward. The Polaris wasn't just a ship, it was a marvel, a floating stronghold of international coordination and technological ambition. Stretching nearly 4 football fields in length, and layered with multiple decks that each served a distinct operational purpose, the vessel operated more like a mobile city-state than a warship. Above the waterline, sleek radar domes and satellite arrays gleamed under the sun, while below the surface, a labyrinth of reinforced steel corridors buzzed with the synchronized heartbeat of nuclear-powered engines. Every room, hallway, and system had been designed to withstand pressure, fire, power loss, cyber attack, and in the most extreme cases, near obliteration. And yet, for all its cutting-edge innovation, the Polaris functioned as much on tradition as it did on technology. Protocol ruled every corner. Hierarchy was gospel. On Deck 1, the command bridge stood like the cerebral cortex of the ship, encased in bulletproof glass and armored bulkheads. It housed the fleet's most elite officers, data strategists, and communications experts. There, Rear Admiral Lawrence Sterling reigned with measured authority, a man whose word could redirect fighter squadrons and whose decisions never bore ambiguity. His presence set the tone for the vessel, sharp, focused, unyielding. Beneath the bridge, spanning several decks, were combat operations rooms, intelligence hubs, drone management bays, and war rooms reserved for joint command deliberations. Further below that, in descending order of operational importance, were crew quarters, engineering bays, storage holds, and finally, the support staff zones, including kitchens, laundry units, waste treatment facilities, and supply depots. Jonah's domain. Each deck was sealed with access checkpoints, retinal scans, and biometric gates. Rank determined your movement, and while Jonah's clearance was minimal, his years aboard had taught him the rhythms of every floor. He knew which lift panels responded sluggishly, which doors hummed faintly before disengaging, which backup ventilation shafts vibrated ever so slightly when tactical comms activated on the bridge. Even without stepping outside the galley, Jonah could sense when drills were real and when they were theater. He could feel it in the way boots echoed in the corridors and in the pauses between PA announcements. The Polaris might have run on nuclear power, but its pulse came from the people within it, and lately, that pulse had been spiking. The air was thick with tension in the days before the order. It crept in like condensation, slow at first, then unrelenting. Jonah noticed the way officers spoke in tighter clusters during meals, how their plates remained half full, while their eyes darted constantly to wall-mounted monitors. He watched the security patrols double, then triple, and saw the subtle but unmistakable tightening of command structures. Protocols became more rigid. Training exercises intensified. And most telling of all, access to lower-level crew like Jonah became even more restricted. It was as if a massive current of urgency surged through the ship, and everyone who didn't have bars on their shoulders was being quietly pushed to the sidelines. The Polaris had been navigating the South Tasman Exclusion Zone, a contested stretch of ocean between covertly hostile territories. Officially, it was labeled a neutral corridor patrolled for anti-piracy operations and peacekeeping surveillance. In reality, it was a pressure cooker. Nations with unspoken grudges, underwater drone fleets, and intelligence skirmishes all collided there under a paper-thin layer of diplomacy. A single misstep, a rogue signal, an intercepted order, any of these could collapse the fragile balance into chaos. Jonah had no access to briefing data, but he didn't need it. The officers might not have recognized the signals, but Jonah had lived through similar climates. The atmosphere was identical to the one that preceded the Lorton crisis 2 decades ago. And in that conflict, the failure to act decisively in time had cost over 200 lives. Jonah had felt it in his bones when the ship shifted course. The Polaris didn't turn like a car or an aircraft. It moved like a glacier with intent, a massive momentum redirected with deliberate force. He could feel it through the soles of his shoes as the engines adjusted, through the ambient sound of metal flexing against ocean current. He had counted exactly 38 minutes between the change in heading and the first emergency code broadcasted over the comms. That wasn't an accident, that was delay. Delay meant confusion. The ship's design didn't allow for uncertainty at the top. And yet, the moment Admiral Sterling had issued the Class 7 protocol, silence followed. Not a productive silence, an empty one. Every officer on the bridge had received the order, but not one of them initiated it. Because Class 7 was from another era, it wasn't part of modern training. It had been deemed unnecessarily complex, reliant on manual overrides and synchronized subsystem resets that weren't compatible with newer AI-assisted defense protocols. Most of the crew hadn't even heard of it, those who had dismissed it as a relic. Yet Sterling had barked the command with full confidence, as if expecting veterans from a long-gone war to appear and execute it without hesitation. They didn't. They froze. The Polaris, for all its brilliance, was now a deafened orchestra with no conductor who understood the score. And while analysts scrambled to cross-reference archives and support teams argued over interpretations of the command, the ship drifted toward a rapidly escalating tactical threat, a silent, submerged enemy preparing to surface and claim first strike. Every passing second deepened the danger. Lives on board were now tethered to a forgotten strategy and the fragmented memory of a single man who didn't even wear a uniform. Jonah had not been on the bridge, nor had he been summoned. But down in the galley, he had felt it, that peculiar, nauseating stillness of leadership caught in its own echo chamber. He had heard the coded words, parsed them from the audio looped through the wall comms in the corridor. He had tasted the fear as thick as grease on an unwashed skillet. This wasn't theory anymore. This was real. And amid the gleaming metal corridors, the constant hum of generators, and the labyrinth of hardened steel, something quietly shifted. In the heart of a ship designed to serve generals and data-fed tacticians, the old instinct of one cafeteria worker, buried under years of routine, began to stir. The Polaris wasn't built for miracles, but it was about to witness one. Rear Admiral Lawrence Sterling was not a man who tolerated deviation. To those under his command, he embodied the doctrine of absolute precision, a figure whose voice, though rarely raised, could cleave through a room like a blade. With his steely blue eyes and posture as rigid as the iron bulkheads of the Polaris, he projected a force of order so total that even his silences held authority. Every crease in his uniform was razor-sharp, every syllable clipped with the cold confidence of a man who believed in control as the highest form of discipline. He did not joke, did not indulge familiarity, and most certainly did not question himself. And in his mind, that day he had done exactly what was necessary. Admiral Sterling came from a long line of military men, each decorated in his own time, and each shadow looming large in the Sterling legacy. He had studied strategy like scripture, rising through the ranks not with charm or popularity, but with ruthless efficiency and an unbroken record of procedural success. He was a man of systems, of doctrine, of legacy. And it was that very legacy, anchored in outdated codes and buried contingencies, that had driven him to invoke the Class 7 protocol when the Polaris crossed into hostile detection range. He had seen the signs weeks earlier, quietly intercepted sonar pings, veiled satellite anomalies, patterns of movement disguised as civilian patrols. He knew what was coming. And he knew that modern AI-governed defense protocols would be too slow, too fragmented, too dependent on layered confirmation hierarchies. The only hope was a maneuver few even remembered existed, a high-risk, all-systems redirection that could only work if executed in perfect synchronization. A protocol so old it predated the ship itself, and when Sterling gave the order, he expected it to be followed without question. But it wasn't. Instead, the command bridge fell into a dense, paralyzing confusion. Sterling watched as officers hesitated, eyes darting to console panels, to one another, to the Admiral himself. A quiet panic radiated beneath the surface, a dawning realization that the command he'd given wasn't part of any current tactical framework. It wasn't in the training manuals. It wasn't in the AI playbooks. It wasn't listed in the priority escalation charts. And the few who vaguely recognized the term, men and women too young to have ever practiced it, were unwilling to act without guidance. Guidance Sterling wasn't interested in offering. In his mind, hesitation was the real threat. If they didn't move quickly, a foreign fleet could breach the corridor, trigger a defensive entanglement, and spark the very international crisis they were tasked to prevent. This wasn't a drill. This was an approaching storm. And now, with every second that passed, the Polaris was dead in the water. Sterling's authority had always been absolute, but now it faltered, not because he lacked conviction, but because the chain of command beneath him had eroded under the weight of its own modernization. The men and women around him were trained for precision within familiar frameworks. They were strategists of simulations, experts of abstraction, not warriors forged in uncertainty. The Admiral watched them freeze not out of cowardice, but because the world he knew, the one in which gut instinct and decisive memory held sway, had been quietly overwritten by protocol-dependent systems that demanded too many failsafes. Sterling's command, though born of urgency, had become incomprehensible in the new language of naval warfare. He grew angrier by the minute, issuing the same command in different phrasing, reasserting rank, threatening consequences. Still, the hesitation remained. Sub-lieutenants checked archives. Senior officers debated interpretations. The AI guidance system offered a fallback routine incompatible with the maneuver's legacy logic. A junior tech, trembling, suggested awaiting input from Fleet Command. Sterling silenced him with a single look. There was no time, and yet no one moved. The flaw wasn't in the protocol. It was in the culture that had grown around him, one that had forgotten how to think without digital assistance, how to act without committee. Sterling didn't fear battle. He feared irrelevance. He feared becoming the last man on the bridge who still knew how to navigate the ocean by stars. And in that moment, as the ship idled in escalating danger, he realized with a cold, dawning clarity that his voice, once absolute, had become just another sound in a sea of hesitation. Below deck, the alarm klaxons pulsed in rhythm, casting red light across the walls. Emergency comms flickered, pressure indicators began shifting. Threat proximity data populated secondary displays with increasing urgency. The Polaris's defense perimeter was being tested. Submersibles had begun shadowing their hull. Drones had been pinged but not engaged. The ship was being probed. It was no longer just a hypothetical scenario. The enemy, whoever they were, was waiting for one more mistake. And Sterling, for all his rank and righteousness, couldn't do anything but repeat the order. In his mind, there was no room for reinterpretation. The problem was not his judgment, but the incompetence of those who had failed to evolve with him. He blamed the academies, the reliance on AI confirmation systems, the endless revisions to operational manuals that had stripped initiative from the rank and file. The situation above all demanded clarity. Instead, the Polaris swam in ambiguity. Sterling's command was crystal, but no one could understand the language he was speaking anymore. And so, the Admiral shouted louder. He stormed between consoles, pointing to tactical maps, demanding compliance, invoking emergency clause after clause in the hope that one would trigger the correct response. His voice cracked from the strain. Still, the order remained unfulfilled. Officers began whispering to each other when they thought he couldn't hear. Their eyes no longer held deference. They held doubt. In that moment, something inside Sterling cracked. Not outwardly, not visibly, but deep behind his disciplined gaze. It was the realization that control, which he had always believed to be his greatest strength, was useless if no one else understood the map he was navigating. And worse, he had no new map to offer. He had placed his entire bet on a past no one remembered, and the cost of that gamble was now spiraling out of reach. This was the conflict Jonah Sorell stepped into, not a battle of bullets or borders, but of language, of time, of forgotten wisdom colliding with technological inertia. Above, the Admiral stood surrounded by silence. Below, in the shadows of the Polaris's lower decks, a cafeteria worker opened a control panel that hadn't been touched in years. And unlike the officers trained to question before acting, Jonah remembered the order. He knew what it meant. And more importantly, he knew what to do next. 2 weeks after the sudden cancellation of Admiral Thorne's order and the quiet demotion of Lieutenant Commander Rex, something strange began happening on base. Routine changed. It started subtly. Slight delays in morning briefings, odd discrepancies in the fuel logs, and small miscommunications between departments that had always functioned like clockwork. Officers whispered of unseen eyes, as if the base itself had become sentient, tracking them, remembering everything. But beneath those whispers lay a heavier silence, the kind that sank into men's bones when instinct told them something bigger was coming. The tension was palpable. For Jackson Teller, however, the situation felt familiar. Not because of his prior experience. He had none in security or strategy. but because he had seen how chaos crept into places from within, like when his father's construction firm was sabotaged from the inside by a disgruntled employee no one paid attention to until it was too late. Jackson, though merely a cafeteria worker with no military stripes or tactical clearance, noticed things others didn't. That was his quiet strength. Every morning, before the rush of breakfast orders, he would prepare the coffee stations along the back hall of Command Tower Bravo. It was in those early hours, when most of the base was still shuffling into wakefulness, that he began to piece together the oddity of the changes happening around him. A lieutenant from comms had stopped by and muttered under his breath about strange code requests being sent to the satellite relay, but then brushed it off as a software bug. Another officer complained about reissued orders with slightly altered coordinates that led a drone fleet 40 miles off their expected course. But no one followed up. Everyone was too preoccupied with smoothing the next hiccup to question the cause. Everyone except Jackson. He didn't know what he was seeing at first. It was like standing too close to a mural, the colors blurring together, but with each day, each whispered complaint, each stack of untouched food orders in departments that claimed to have eaten elsewhere, the picture widened. Something was wrong with the system, or worse, someone was bending it without leaving fingerprints. Jackson knew better than to speak up without evidence. In a military base like Garnet Point, unfounded accusations were career suicide, and in his case, would be dismissed entirely. He wasn't even officially allowed into Command Tower Bravo, let alone briefed on classified operations, but he had learned to move quietly, invisibly. His custodial badge, an overlooked remnant from when he used to handle cafeteria waste routes, still had access to floors he technically no longer needed to enter. He wasn't supposed to use it, but nobody had ever deactivated it, and no one questioned the janitor or lunchman, especially when he carried a mop or food tray. So Jackson started watching, quietly, meticulously. He memorized the times when the upper floors went dark, the pattern of officers staying late in the logistics wing, the way requisitions for non-perishable food had doubled in Storage Bunker C despite no recent increase in personnel. One night, he found a stack of printed satellite reports in a bin behind Commander Teague's office. It was unusual. Security documents weren't supposed to be printed on that floor at all. He scanned the codes. They meant nothing to him, just numbers and letters. But he noted them down anyway, photographed them with his old cracked phone, and tucked the images away in a password-protected folder named Pie Recipes. Meanwhile, morale around the base continued to fracture. Admiral Thorne, once a man of firm direction and roaring commands, had become more cautious, withdrawn. He sensed the breakdown but didn't know where it was coming from. After the failed black signal incident and the embarrassment it brought upon him, he could no longer issue orders the same way. He trusted almost no one. The chain of command was fraying. What should have been a stable operation had become a paranoid hive, buzzing with unseen threat. And right in the center of it all, someone was orchestrating the chaos. Jackson didn't sleep well those days. At night, he dreamed of red lights and sirens, of empty cafeterias filled with echoing footsteps and distant alarms. He'd wake in cold sweats, convinced that at any moment his door would be kicked in by armed officers accusing him of spying, or worse. But he couldn't stop. He knew that if he didn't keep paying attention, nobody else would. Then came the night the access systems glitched. For nearly an hour, all internal locks on level 4 of the command tower cycled open and closed in rapid intervals, allowing anyone in the right place at the right time to enter restricted zones. It was dismissed as a temporary software patch failure, but Jackson knew better. It wasn't random. Someone had triggered the event, perhaps to test a breach path or lay groundwork for something larger. Jackson returned to his room that evening and stared at the folder on his old phone. Pie Recipes. Inside were 47 screenshots of seemingly unrelated logs, intercepted messages, shifted coordinates, energy usage spikes, and transfer orders that painted no obvious picture but hinted at a single truth. Someone inside the base was preparing for something that had nothing to do with their official mission. He didn't know how to decode military jargon, but he knew someone who might. That's when he remembered Rosalind, a retired cryptanalyst turned barista who worked the coffee stand near the hangar bay. She was quiet, never spoke of her past unless prompted, but everyone on base knew she once cracked a classified code faster than the AI designed to do it. Jackson knew it was a risk. But he also knew that if he didn't take it, the base might not survive whatever was coming. So, the next morning, as personnel hustled into formation for their daily drill and Admiral Thorne stood silently at the observation deck with furrowed brows, Jackson took a long breath, pocketed his phone, and walked toward Rosalind's kiosk. He didn't have the stripes, he didn't have clearance, but he had something no one else on base seemed to have anymore: clarity and a gut instinct honed from a lifetime of being ignored. This time, he hoped being overlooked would work in his favor. By the time the smoke cleared from the simulated blast, the command deck of the USS Valor was in a state of stunned paralysis. Charts flickered on cracked monitors, sirens still wailed in short bursts, and the Admiral's voice had grown hoarse from shouting orders no one could execute. The failure wasn't because the crew lacked discipline or knowledge. It was because the scenario had gone so far off script that even the most seasoned officers couldn't think their way out of it. The digital war game, designed to mimic a full-scale cyberkinetic ambush, had exposed something chilling beneath the surface of their military precision: the absence of improvisational courage. And in the eye of this storm, unnoticed by nearly everyone, stood Nico, with his mop half submerged in a puddle of soapy water and his mind whirring at a pace he hadn't allowed it to run in years. He hadn't come to the Valor looking to reclaim anything. The cafeteria position had been a form of penance, a way to be near what he once loved while avoiding the pain of confronting it. But seeing the Admiral break down and the crew freeze as if time itself had stalled, it awakened something dormant in him, something dangerous, something true. He was still just a mess hall worker, technically, yet the knowledge buried inside him came clawing to the surface like a creature uncaged. And in that silence that followed another unanswered command, he stepped forward again, this time not to apologize for speaking, but to make himself heard. His voice, neither loud nor harsh, carried with eerie precision across the room. He didn't scream, he didn't demand, he simply stated what was needed in that moment. If we reroute command through secondary lines echoing Portside K, we can isolate the rogue signal and stabilize the shields, he said. The room turned to him again. Admiral Rutledge, still heaving slightly, narrowed his eyes. His throat moved, but no words came out. He had tried that exact maneuver earlier, except his method had used outdated protocols. Nico's variation required overlaying an ancient command routine from the War Games archive, one that had been dismissed as obsolete, but not to Nico, because he remembered the flaws in that design, because he had written the override for it 10 years ago. Nico didn't wait for permission. He walked to the operations terminal, and a junior officer instinctively stepped aside. Hands still damp from his mop handle, Nico typed with calm intensity. Every keystroke reawakened muscle memory he thought had died with his clearance. On screen, the cascading failure halted. Monitors blinked green. The alarms dropped to a low hum, and then silence. A collective breath was held. Systems rerouted and reran diagnostics. In 15 seconds, the USS Valor was back in simulated control. The Admiral didn't say anything for a few moments. The room seemed caught in suspended disbelief. And Nico, now standing behind the ops terminal, looked less like a janitor and more like the man he used to be. But even so, no applause followed. No immediate recognition. Just confusion. Protocols had been broken, a civilian had intervened, and it didn't fit into the Navy's tight framework of control. The Admiral turned to his officers, his pride still prickling. "Find out who gave him that access," he muttered, "and find out who he really is." As security scrambled, Nico stepped back, ready to be dragged away. He knew how this worked. It wasn't the first time he'd broken rules to save lives. It never ended smoothly. Except this time, someone else moved first. Commander Hartley, young, calculating, previously dismissive of Nico, spoke up. "Admiral, sir, the override code he used? It's not in the current database. It's not even listed in our legacy systems. The only reference I could find is from a deleted sandbox from Project Delphi." At that word, the Admiral's face changed, a flash of recognition, of buried memory. Project Delphi. He repeated slowly, the name falling from his lips like a ghost returning. The officers around him looked puzzled. None of them were old enough to know what Delphi was. Except Rutledge, because he'd been there. He looked again at Nico, and this time it wasn't with suspicion. It was with fear, and maybe, just maybe, with respect. "Get me a list of every engineer and analyst who served Delphi post-failure," he barked. Hartley tapped quickly. "Name matches. Nico Halberg, systems architect. Presumed dead after the crash at Titan's wake. He disappeared." Murmurs erupted across the room. The cafeteria worker, the quiet man mopping floors, had once designed the very systems they were using now. The Admiral's hands gripped the edge of the console, and for the first time in the entire exercise, he didn't know what to say. Nico didn't gloat. He didn't look proud. In fact, he looked deeply tired. "I didn't want this," he said softly. "But you needed help. I couldn't just watch." That single line changed the air. It wasn't just about the system failure anymore. It wasn't about an old wargame protocol. It was about character. Someone had stepped up when it mattered. Someone who wasn't wearing the right uniform. Someone who hadn't been given orders, but gave them. The very essence of leadership. In the aftermath of that moment, the USS Valor didn't return to the standard protocol. Everything had been cracked open. Hierarchies were questioned. Assumptions shattered. But none of that meant the system would welcome Nico back. In fact, it might make him a target. Because the truth, even when it saves the day, often threatens the comfort of power. And Nico had just reminded everyone that brilliance doesn't always wear rank. Sometimes, it wears an apron and carries a mop. But once it's seen, it cannot be unseen. And as the simulation concluded and officers reviewed footage, every eye returned to that critical moment, when the Admiral had shouted, and the only one who responded wasn't trained to, but did. Everything changed the day the sirens screamed louder than usual, a grating alarm that sent an unnatural vibration through the reinforced walls of the command vessel. The Admiral's voice thundered through the PA system, shouting a series of rapid, near-incomprehensible orders, each more chaotic than the last. At first the crew tried to comply, but their confusion was written plainly on their faces, as fingers hovered over blinking consoles, and officers barked contradictory instructions at each other. The situation, whatever it was escalating faster than the protocols could handle. No one seemed to know the nature of the threat or how to respond to it. A sudden external event had shifted the dynamics of the mission completely, and in the heat of that moment, the Admiral, normally so composed, had lost the ability to give clear, executable orders. Stress, fear, or perhaps something deeper had seized control of his judgment, and his booming voice, once a source of command and stability, now only heightened the panic. In the heart of the chaos, Rico stood at the edge of the galley doorway, unnoticed by the flurry of motion and noise. He should have stayed out of it. He was, after all, a cafeteria worker. His job was to make sure the crew had hot meals, not to navigate tactical emergencies. But something in him had shifted. Maybe it had been months of watching from the margins. Maybe it was the weight of his own past that would no longer stay buried. Or maybe it was just the simple fact that he could see what others couldn't, that this was the kind of moment where a clear head mattered more than a decorated uniform. He stepped through the threshold with quiet purpose, weaving through frantic personnel, ignoring the shouts telling him to get back. His eyes scanned the giant, tactical screens. Rico didn't need to guess. He knew what they were seeing, and worse, he knew what was coming. Without asking for permission, Rico approached Lieutenant Harper, who was closest to the central control interface. Her fingers were trembling over the keyboard. her eyes flitting between conflicting orders and malfunctioning subroutines. Rico's voice was calm, deliberate and measured as he asked her to pull up the threat data. She hesitated, but there was something so grounding in his tone that she complied, almost reflexively. And there it was, a silent, undetected object approaching fast from a blind zone in their sensors, a route so obscure it hadn't even been programmed into the ship's usual surveillance paths. Rico's mind moved faster than his lips. He could see it as clearly as if it had been written across the stars. This wasn't an accident. It was a precision threat, something designed by someone who understood the ship as well as he did. Maybe better. He issued a command to divert auxiliary power to a buried sensor array, an old trick from a past life he'd once promised never to revisit. The moment the signal rerouted, the screen flickered and revealed a narrow-profile drone moving like a phantom across their flank. Rico called for a forward dispersal sonar ping to confirm, then overrode the Admiral's last standing order to power down communications, reopening a direct line with the security grid. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't panicked. And yet, one by one, the officers and tech crew around him began to fall into line, not because they recognized him, but because they recognized the sound of someone who knew what they were doing. The Admiral, still shouting from the upper deck, noticed too late what was happening below. He rushed toward the control platform, fury in his stride, demanding to know who had taken command of his ship. When he saw Rico standing at the helm, it wasn't rage that colored his face. It was confusion, disbelief. The cafeteria worker, the man who served soup and cleaned trays, was now giving orders that the entire crew seemed to follow without question. Rico didn't flinch. He turned to the Admiral with a strange steadiness in his eyes and laid out the threat parameters, the blind spot in the radar, the incoming vector of the drone, and the countermeasures that needed immediate execution. The Admiral froze. Rico had spoken with precision and clarity that cut through the fog of his panic. It was as if he were speaking a language the Admiral had forgotten. Then, without waiting for affirmation, Rico made the final call to deploy a low-frequency EM pulse that would disable the incoming drone without damaging the ship's systems. The crew held their breath as the pulse launched, a low hum reverberating through the vessel. Seconds passed. Then a signal blinked on the screen. The drone had gone dead. Its propulsion system collapsed mid-flight. Silence fell over the control room. Everyone slowly turned to look at Rico, still standing there in his stained apron and rolled-up sleeves, his chest rising and falling, not from exertion but from resolve. The Admiral didn't speak. He didn't have to. For the first time, the crew wasn't looking to him for answers. They were looking at the man who had stepped into the storm and walked them out of it. In that instant, Rico became something more than a background figure. He became the quiet center of gravity around which the chaos had briefly found order. But it wasn't about glory, and it wasn't about defiance. It was about doing what needed to be done when no one else could or would. And though the Admiral's pride stung in that silence, even he couldn't deny that the man in front of him had done what he could not. Rico simply nodded once, then stepped away from the console, disappearing back toward the galley. But the ship wouldn't forget what had happened, and neither would the people who had just watched a cafeteria worker save them all from disaster. It had been 2 days since the outburst in the Situation Room, and the mood aboard the USS Hartford had changed drastically. A grim stillness floated over the ship like a low fog, thick and unshakable. Conversations were reduced to whispers, eye contact avoided, and routines executed with a mechanical, haunted detachment. Admiral Keating had confined himself mostly to the captain's quarters, while Commander Matsuoka led a series of closed-door meetings with his trusted officers in an attempt to salvage what remained of order and morale. The mission had not been scrubbed, but it was on indefinite hold. No new directives had been issued, and the naval hierarchy on board had become little more than ceremonial. The strike group lingered in the Pacific like a ghost fleet, paralyzed by indecision and unseen wounds. Everyone waited, but for what? Nobody was quite sure. Meanwhile, in the galley, Renzo quietly resumed his duties. He returned to serving meals, chopping vegetables, brewing coffee, and refilling the condiment station as if nothing had happened. But beneath his composed exterior, a subtle shift was taking place. Where he had once kept his head down and moved through his duties invisibly, Renzo now carried himself with a quiet intention. He no longer avoided the eyes of the officers. He greeted people by name. He offered a warm joke to a seaman who looked particularly beaten down. He placed a second cookie on Lieutenant Franco's tray when he looked like he hadn't slept. His kindness, like a slow tide, began to creep back into the corners of the ship. It wasn't flashy or loud, but it was noticed. Renzo had also begun journaling in his bunk late at night. The pen scratched across the page with purpose, capturing reflections, memories, lessons, and fears. He wasn't sure why he started doing it. Maybe to make sense of everything. Maybe to keep his mind from spiraling into helplessness. But as he wrote, an idea began to form. Not a strategy or a solution to the mission, but a question. What if the key wasn't knowledge or rank or military expertise? What if the real battlefield wasn't external at all? What if the war was inside each man and woman aboard, and the true enemy was fear? One evening, as the sun sank below the western edge of the sea, casting long streaks of crimson across the waves, Renzo sat alone at the aft observation deck, sipping instant coffee and letting the salt air fill his lungs. He watched a group of young sailors performing maintenance checks with slumped shoulders and empty expressions. He thought about their families, their childhoods, the lives they were trying to protect without ever fully understanding the scope of the conflict they were part of. And then, almost involuntarily, he muttered aloud, "What if they're waiting for someone to just believe in them?" That night, he slept soundly for the first time since the incident. The following morning, something unexpected happened. Chief Engineering Officer Grayson, known for his standoffish nature and unshakable logic, came into the galley earlier than usual. He sat at the counter, alone, and motioned for Renzo. Without a word, Renzo poured him a mug of the stronger brew. Grayson looked up, his eyes shadowed, and asked quietly, "You really think what you said in that room about heart? You think it matters more than protocol?" Renzo didn't answer with rhetoric or philosophy. He simply said, "I've seen men crumble with full honors, and I've seen boys stand tall when no one gave them a chance. Heart doesn't follow rank. It's either alive in you or it's not." Grayson said nothing, but he sat for a while longer, sipping his coffee, eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. Word spread, not through gossip, but through something deeper, a shift in tone, a renewed sense of quiet camaraderie. Officers started sitting next to enlisted men again in the mess hall. Crew members who hadn't spoken in days shared jokes over trays of mashed potatoes. People began to remember each other's names, and Renzo noticed that even the act of serving food became an unspoken ritual of care and connection. One by one, the hardened shells began to crack, and though no formal orders had changed, the soul of the ship was stirring. It was then that Renzo decided to act, not to take command, not to defy the Admiral or challenge authority, but to offer something different. That night, he asked Commander Matsuoka for permission to host a voluntary gathering in the main briefing room. Not a tactical session, but something simpler, a conversation, a place for anyone on board to speak freely about what they were feeling, what they feared, and what they hoped for. Matsuoka hesitated at first. This wasn't standard military protocol, but something in Renzo's tone made him relent. "Just don't call it group therapy," he said, half smiling. "Sailors don't go for that." The first night, only 5 people showed up. Renzo shared a story from his childhood in Cavite, about watching his mother hold the family together through typhoons and blackouts. He spoke about the moment he realized strength wasn't about lifting burdens. It was about helping others carry theirs. The room was silent, but the eyes around him were locked in. The next night, 12 people came. Then 30. Then the room was full. Men and women from every rank and division shared stories, laughter, tears. They talked about dreams they'd left behind, brothers lost in past battles, regrets they'd never voiced. In that room, barriers dissolved. By the end of the week, even Commander Matsuoka began attending silently in the back, his arms crossed but his expression softened. It wasn't a revolution. and it wasn't rebellion. It was something gentler but more profound. A restoration of purpose. And for the first time since the mission began, the USS Hartford felt alive again. Renzo didn't give a speech. He didn't seek validation. He just kept showing up, brewing coffee, cutting onions, and opening space for people to remember why they were out there in the first place. And though the mission clock still ticked in the control room, something far more important had begun to unfold. The crew was ready to feel again. Ready to listen. Ready to follow, not just orders, but each other. And that's when the Admiral finally emerged. The air inside the control deck had shifted. It wasn't just the stench of stale sweat or the low thrum of electrical systems barely holding together. It was something unspoken, an intangible tremor that passed between the eyes of trained naval officers, eyes that had seen war and weathered commands. They were watching someone they didn't understand. Emery Dawson, the man with the cafeteria badge, was standing behind Admiral Redgrave's chair, a quiet force with a strange calm in the midst of rising chaos. Nobody knew what to do, because Dawson wasn't following protocol. He wasn't part of the chain of command, but neither was anyone else truly leading, and that absence was like a vacuum pulling him forward. While others watched for their next order, Dawson had already moved. Admiral Redgrave had retreated inside himself. He wasn't the stoic pillar anymore. He was locked in some mental loop, muttering fragments about timelines, trajectories, and the silence before collapse. Dawson had seen that look before. Not here, not in this context, but in places that smelled like bleach and lemon jello, and were filled with men who looked at ceilings and didn't remember their names. His father had worn that expression in the final days, sitting motionless in the porch swing while the world moved around him. And just like he'd done back then, Dawson gently laid a hand on the Admiral's shoulder, grounding him. It was something almost nobody noticed, but to Redgrave, it cut through the fog like a lighthouse beam in stormy waters. His breathing hitched. He looked up. And for a brief second, clarity flickered behind his eyes. But that clarity didn't last, and it was clear now that if anything was going to be salvaged from this operation, it would have to come from someone else. Dawson didn't ask for permission. He leaned over the console, absorbing the half-transmitted codes and countdown timers flashing in red. The problem wasn't technical, not entirely. It was psychological. The command deck had frozen, not because systems failed, but because morale had been fractured. Everyone was waiting for leadership, and leadership had collapsed under pressure. Dawson remembered something from his janitorial days on the upper decks. Lessons from the maintenance logs he wasn't supposed to see, theories buried in scribbled margins by engineers long gone. There had been simulations about what to do in a system-wide failure, not just digital, but human failure. That scenario had a name: ghost lock. It meant the human mind locked up in synchrony with mechanical protocols, everyone waiting for an input that would never come because they believed someone else was responsible. That was what this was, ghost lock. Dawson grabbed the nearest comms headset, ignoring the stunned eyes around him. He spoke into the system with a voice that surprised even himself. Calm, deep, and resolute. He didn't ask for clearance. He simply gave the first instruction: reset the delta loop on Sector 12 and reroute power to lateral drives. No one moved at first, uncertain whether it was real. But then, from the lower engineering bay, a voice crackled back. Copy that. Rerouting now. That tiny moment sparked the first crack in the paralysis. Dawson moved quickly, issuing small, clear commands to different departments. Nothing overwhelming, just pieces, manageable bits that gave people the ability to act again. His strength wasn't in authority. It was in his understanding of people. He knew when someone needed direction and when someone needed permission. And he gave them both, disguised in instructions that sounded routine. In the viewing deck above, Commander Mallory watched from behind the tinted glass, stunned. She had come up after getting word that something was happening on Deck Alpha. and she couldn't reconcile what she was seeing. The cafeteria worker was commanding naval protocol like he'd been born to do it. But it wasn't just his fluency. It was the way he made people believe again. The Admiral sat still, his breathing more even now, eyes blinking slowly, but he said nothing. Dawson, sensing the moment had momentum now, asked for all departments to transmit status reports and sync their diagnostics through Channel 7. Slowly, the decks that had been in shadow flickered back online. The comms board, once flooded with static and overlapping queries, now started to take form again. The bridge lit up with data, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the collective heartbeat of the station began to return to rhythm. But the problem was far from over. The solar storm outside was still flaring. The radiation levels had jumped past forecast, and a narrow-band EMP surge had already taken out one of the auxiliary nodes. The question now was whether they could navigate the corridor without catastrophic failure, or worse, triggering the hidden ordnance embedded in the vessel's underbelly. Dawson turned toward Mallory, who had entered silently. Their eyes met. It was a silent passing of weight, not rank, but responsibility. Mallory nodded slightly, enough to give him permission to keep going. She wasn't sure how or why he was doing this, but it was working. And in a moment like this, function trumped formality. Dawson asked for a diagnostic overlay on the magnetic shielding grid. No one moved. He repeated it, calmly. One technician finally complied, and a topographic map spread across the main screen. There, 3 weak points. He pointed to a convergence pattern that had gone unnoticed in prior simulations. A glitch in the shielding algorithm would collapse the buffer if the solar wave peaked at the current trajectory, and it would, within minutes. Dawson's hands flew across the interface, cross-referencing diagnostic logs, rerouting surge suppressors, pulling non-essential power from lighting, storage bays, even the entertainment grid, and pushing it to the shield buffer array. The lights dimmed slightly, but the shield strength increased. In silence, the crew began to follow his lead, not because he had stars on his shoulder, but because he had given them a path when all they had was panic. What he had done, without knowing it, was something even command manuals couldn't teach. He had shifted the emotional inertia of the crew from fear to focus, and that alone had bought them time. The room had gone from disbelief to breathless anticipation, each officer now watching Charlie not with skepticism, but with the odd stillness that comes when one realizes they're witnessing something rare. As he concluded his explanation, a hushed silence hovered over the command center. Admiral Beckett, who had barely spoken since Charlie's impromptu demonstration began, finally stepped forward. His usual booming voice was tempered with something closer to reverence, a strange humility in his eyes. He didn't fully understand the systems the way Charlie did, but what he did understand was leadership, and what it looked like when someone rose to the occasion with the clarity and composure of a seasoned commander. With a nod, Beckett signaled to the operators to initiate Charlie's plan. That nod would change everything. As the tactical units moved in tandem with the calculated phasing of systems Charlie had suggested, things began to fall into rhythm. The destroyers once again came online, and rather than overload, they began cycling power in intervals, diffusing the pressure that had previously risked blowing the entire unit. The attack subs initiated their migration to the lower trench zones, and within 5 minutes, the erratic readings that had been destabilizing the sonar systems began to normalize. The waves on the sonar screen settled. Indicators flashed from red to yellow, then finally to green. Slowly but surely, the tension that had gripped the room began to uncoil. Commander Rains, the sharpest tactical officer on the floor, looked up from her panel with wide eyes. She turned to Charlie with something like stunned admiration. The room began buzzing as personnel realized the tide had not only turned, it had done so with a fluidity that felt almost too good to be true. But it wasn't magic. It was Charlie, and it was preparation. Charlie had been listening, watching, understanding not just the operations of the ship, but the psychology of leadership in crisis. The problem had never been just about code or tech. It was about communication, belief, trust, and an ability to see when systems were too rigid to adapt. That was the trap the Admiral had fallen into. It was the trap everyone in that room had defaulted to, until Charlie shattered it. With the immediate threat stabilized, Beckett ordered a complete operational assessment. Every officer was now actively taking instructions from Charlie, and he was directing like he'd been doing this his whole life. With clarity and urgency, he delegated tasks to tactical, communications, diagnostics, and propulsion teams, ensuring redundancy systems were restored, that emergency power was routed for medical decks, and that the comm arrays could begin broadcasting stabilization signals to nearby fleets. At this point, it wasn't just about fixing the immediate crisis. Charlie was preparing for contingencies, thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. What made it all the more powerful was that he wasn't barking commands. He asked questions, he listened, he elevated the strengths of others. And in doing so, he made the room smarter, faster, more coherent. Officers who had never looked twice at the cafeteria worker now hung onto his words like lifelines. Ensign Lopez, who had once sneered when Charlie asked if he could use the lower terminal to run mock drills, now looked at him with the dazed expression of someone realizing they'd overlooked a treasure right under their nose. Charlie didn't bask in it. He didn't even seem to notice. His focus remained razor-sharp. There was no time for pride, not with the mission still underway. But beneath that calm, he felt something rising in him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Not just competence, but belonging. Meanwhile, Admiral Beckett stood near the large window, overlooking the vast ocean beyond the ship. He watched the stabilization lines flow cleanly across the main console and exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. He turned slowly and looked at Charlie. The same man who'd once dismissed him without even making eye contact now met his eyes directly. Beckett walked across the room and stood beside him. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I didn't see you before, but the whole fleet sees you now." Charlie nodded quietly and returned to his work. That acknowledgement was enough. But as the room regained full control and command protocol resumed, word began to spread beyond the main ship. Other fleet captains began hailing command to find out how the situation had stabilized. Beckett took those calls, and he gave Charlie credit. Each time, unfiltered, unflinching. He called him by name. He called him Mr. Everett, and later, Systems Advisor Everett. With each call, Charlie's name moved further across the fleet, and with it, a story that began to inspire everyone who heard it. But recognition, while well-deserved, wasn't what Charlie was focused on. What mattered was that they had bought time, not just for the ship, but for the fragile peace that was barely holding together across the region. There were still threats, still mines in the water, still frayed diplomatic ties and rogue units, testing the edges of war. But now, there was unity in the command center. Now, there was direction. And with that, Charlie knew the real test wasn't over. It had only just begun. He had earned their attention. Now he had to use it wisely. As he looked around the room, at the men and women who had once overlooked him but now followed him without hesitation, he understood that leadership wasn't about having power or rank. It was about being willing to step forward when everyone else was frozen. And he had done that, not with a title, not with orders, but with courage and quiet, relentless preparation, the kind no one sees until everything is on the line. And as he looked at Admiral Beckett, who now watched him not as a subordinate but as an equal, Charlie realized the ship wasn't just stable again. It was finally sailing in the right direction. The days that followed felt like the aftermath of a storm. The situation had stabilized, but the memory of what happened that night lingered in every corridor, every hushed conversation, every sideways glance exchanged in the cafeteria line. The base, still grappling with the fallout from Admiral Keene's breakdown, turned to Admiral Brennan for direction. And quietly, almost awkwardly, they turned to Theo as well. He didn't ask for it. He didn't want it. But he couldn't ignore it. It started small. Just a few of the junior technicians dropping by his kitchen window with questions they didn't feel comfortable taking to their superiors. Then it was a supply runner who confided in him about the pressure of transporting sensitive materials under Brennan's new tighter protocols. Eventually, Lieutenant Yu approached him directly and asked if he'd sit in on a morale briefing, not as a speaker, but as a, quote, perspective holder. Theo had no idea what that meant, but he went anyway. In that briefing room, surrounded by officers, logistics heads, and engineering leads, Theo sat quietly while others talked over each other. They were trying to figure out how to balance discipline with humanity, order with mental health awareness, readiness with resilience. Theo sat and listened, and then, when there was a pause long enough to make everyone uncomfortable, he raised his hand. He said maybe the solution wasn't in rebalancing protocols or writing new manuals. Maybe it wasn't helping people feel like they mattered outside their role. Maybe, he suggested, leadership shouldn't be about knowing everything, but about being willing to admit when they didn't, and then listening. The room was silent again, but this time, not because of tension. Lieutenant Yu leaned forward and asked him to elaborate. So Theo did. He talked about the night of the command center crisis. He talked about Keen's eyes, wild and vacant. He talked about the looks on the officers' faces when orders came through that no one could parse. He explained that what snapped them out of it wasn't hierarchy or training. It was vulnerability. One man stepping forward and saying, "I don't understand either, but let's figure it out together." He told them that what saved that moment wasn't leadership in the traditional sense, it was connection. The next week, a memo went out across the base, outlining a new internal initiative called Echo Sessions. It was simple. 1 session per week, open to any rank, any department, where people could share questions, ideas, or concerns freely. No structure, no judgment, no names recorded. Theo was listed as a co-facilitator. He didn't want the role, but when he tried to refuse, Yu just smiled and said, "You already are, whether you like it or not." Echo Sessions took off in ways nobody expected. A lieutenant from sonar came in and cried about losing a brother in a training accident. A security guard admitted to panic attacks every time he scanned the lower deck. Even Admiral Brennan sat in once, sharing a moment from his early career when he froze under pressure and almost cost his ship a critical mission. The base began to change, not drastically, not overnight, but slowly and noticeably. People talked more, listened more. There were still rules, still structure, but something had softened around the edges. Theo, meanwhile, was still serving food, still slicing turkey and boiling rice, but the line at his counter felt different now. It wasn't just for food. It was a line of people who saw him, who respected him, who occasionally asked, "Got a minute," and knew he would. One afternoon, weeks after the crisis, Theo received a sealed envelope hand-delivered by a Marine. Inside was a formal citation for extraordinary civilian bravery and service. It was signed by Admiral Brennan, co-signed by a representative from Central Command. But what struck Theo more was the short handwritten note paperclipped to it. "Some leadership isn't learned, it's lived. Thank you for living it when we couldn't." It wasn't about medals or recognition. It never had been. For Theo, it was about showing up, doing his part, and trusting that kindness, genuine, grounded kindness, could cut through even the most rigid chains of command. He remembered standing in that command center weeks ago, heart pounding, sweat pooling at the base of his neck, and thinking he was about to be court-martialed or worse. And now, here he was, no longer invisible, no longer just the cafeteria worker. He hadn't changed, really, but how people saw him had. That, he realized, was the power of one voice when it's used in the moment it's needed most. It wasn't magic. It wasn't heroism. It was human. And sometimes, that's exactly what the system needs to remember how to function. Not more power, but more humanity. And so Theo kept working, kept showing up at 0400 to prep meals and check inventory. But now he did it knowing his presence mattered in ways even he hadn't fully understood before. And every time someone walked past and gave him a nod, a smile, or a quiet thank you, he nodded back. Not because he wanted gratitude, but because he finally understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than yourself, not from the top down, but from the heart outward. The once cold and clinical briefing chamber of the Eastern Command Naval Complex now throbbed with an almost electric sense of purpose. Gone were the grim faces and exhausted stares that had haunted the walls for days. In their place, there was a stirring energy among the ranks, a collective awareness that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that had cracked through layers of protocol, hierarchy, and fear. As Bernard descended the stairwell toward the lower decks, his steps were heavier than usual, not from fatigue, but from the immense emotional weight he carried. What had begun as a simple moment of action, stepping forward to interpret an admiral's impossible command, had evolved into a defining pivot for the entire operation and a reckoning for the man himself. He wasn't just a cafeteria worker anymore. He was something else, though he wasn't quite sure what that meant yet. After the Admiral's moment of public vulnerability and subsequent order reversal, everything began shifting in subtle but significant ways. Captain Lydia Harrow took a formal lead in coordinating the new simulations and debriefs under the Joint Decision Unit, now forming around Bernard's intuitive insights. While Bernard himself declined any official titles, his involvement was no longer passive. He sat in mission rooms. He offered input not from a place of rank, but from a position of human logic, intuition, and grounded wisdom. The language in the facility began to change too. Phrases like "we've always done it this way" gave way to questions like, "does this still make sense under the current stressors?" Officers who had once rolled their eyes at civilian staff now lingered a little longer in conversation. Bernard, in a sense, had become both an ambassador and an anchor, showing what could happen when someone dared to challenge the inertia of tradition with humble clarity. But of course, the spotlight didn't come without shadows. Whispers began trickling through the ranks. There were murmurs in the corridor, some accusing Bernard of being manipulative, of somehow staging his breakthrough to gain attention. Others scoffed that his role had been overblown by those desperate to redeem a humiliating leadership failure. Bernard, for his part, did not defend himself. He returned to the kitchen for his usual shift, though the kitchen staff now treated him like a sort of folk hero. Some nights, he sat alone in the dimly lit corner of the mess hall, sorting through stacks of data and handwritten notes passed to him by Harrow and her new interdisciplinary team. He studied the materials not because anyone asked him to, but because he was determined not to squander this peculiar opportunity fate had thrown his way. One evening, Harrow found him slouched over a manual for spatial temporal interface procedures, something no civilian should have any need to understand. When she questioned him, Bernard looked up with tired but focused eyes. He explained that the Admiral's initial order hadn't been wrong, just issued without context. The protocols had potential, but they had been deployed in isolation, with zero accommodation for real-time decision-making under emotional and psychological duress. Bernard had realized that leadership wasn't just about issuing directives from above. It was about whether those directives could be metabolized by the people expected to carry them out. That was the missing link. It wasn't about intelligence alone, it was about translation. And somehow, in the chaos, Bernard had become the translator. By week's end, an internal memo began circulating from the upper tier of Eastern Command. It praised the reformed decision-making models introduced after the failed simulation. A new doctrine was being proposed, one where operational clarity would be tested not only against technical precision, but against human absorbability. The memo referenced an unexpected but invaluable contributor from civilian support staff. Without naming Bernard directly, that omission didn't bother him. In fact, it made him smile. This wasn't about fame. It was about impact. The cafeteria had once been a place where he merely served. Now it had become his observatory, his quiet watchtower. He watched officers walk in with looser shoulders, watched young recruits nod respectfully when passing him in the hallway. He wasn't above them, he was beside them, a quiet sentinel of common sense in a system that had once glorified complexity for its own sake. Yet, perhaps the most telling shift occurred in Admiral Rutledge himself. Once icy and unreachable, the Admiral had begun showing up quietly at early morning briefings, sitting in the back, listening. He no longer barked orders, he asked questions. He even stopped by the kitchen once, not for a meal, but just to shake Bernard's hand. No words were exchanged, just a nod. But in that silent gesture was an entire apology, an entire reconciliation, an acknowledgement that leadership wasn't about being the smartest person in the room. Sometimes it was about stepping back so someone else could illuminate what everyone else had missed. As Part 12 closes, we find Bernard neither at a podium nor in the spotlight. He's walking through the quiet lower hallway past the command library, carrying a tray of leftover rations for a few guards on night duty. The building hums with renewed coordination, but more than that, it hums with humility, a kind of grounded humanity that had been absent before. And somewhere deep inside Bernard, a new conviction had crystallized. Systems could fail, people could falter, but purpose, if rooted in service, would always find a way to rise through the cracks. Bernard's name may not have been in the circulated memo, but the effects of his quiet transformation had begun to ripple outward in measurable ways. In the days following the Admiral's public concession and the soft restructuring of the decision-making chain, there was a sharp uptick in simulation efficiency, not because the protocols themselves had changed dramatically, but because the people involved in executing them now felt seen. The crews began offering feedback without fear of reprimand. Officers requested joint reviews with enlisted personnel, and middle-tier commanders opened up about weaknesses they would have once buried beneath layers of silence. At the core of this evolution was a reorientation toward the human engine that powered every system, something Bernard had unwittingly become the symbol for. Still, Bernard himself never grew comfortable with the attention. Every time someone tried to praise him, he redirected the conversation toward the team, toward Lydia Harrow's leadership, toward the system as a whole. He didn't crave recognition, only progress. So when Harrow approached him one morning with a curious request, he was taken aback. The Joint Interfacing Task Force wanted Bernard to be present as a civilian observer for a new round of stress simulations, this time integrating live data feeds, environmental contingencies, and randomized emotional pressure triggers. The committee believed Bernard's unique instincts and ability to cut through abstraction could serve as a real-time mirror to the decision-makers under pressure. In simple terms, they wanted him in the room not as a participant but as a lens. He almost declined, but there was something in Harrow's face, not a command, not persuasion, but a genuine trust, that convinced him to say yes. And so Bernard found himself seated in a gallery box above Simulation Bay 4, a massive hangar-style chamber rigged with projectors, neural response trackers, and holographic threat generators. The room buzzed with a clinical tension. Uniforms rustled, commands flew, synthetic wind patterns blew across the bay floor as the scenario launched, a hostile intercept. Fog of war, disrupted communications, civilian casualties mounting on the periphery of the decision matrix. The commanding officer fumbled early, defaulting to the outdated sequence of conditional assessments. The team hesitated. The simulation time ticked forward. A miscommunication led to a catastrophic spike in collateral exposure. Bernard felt a sickness in his gut, not from the failure, but from the clear visibility of it. The same pattern repeating again despite all the talk of reform. And then something curious happened. One of the junior analysts broke formation, adjusted a data filter, and flagged the emotional load as disproportionate to mission trajectory. Instead of scolding him, the supervising officer paused, reassessed the priority tags, and reoriented the mission flow to isolate key decision pressure points. It was subtle, but enough to reverse course and bring the simulation toward recovery. In that moment, Bernard understood the long game. It wasn't about eliminating error. It was about shifting the cultural reflex from defensiveness to responsiveness. After the test concluded, Bernard was invited to speak to the task force. He didn't deliver a speech. He offered a single question: can your people live with the weight of your decisions? It hung in the air like a tuning fork. No one answered, because the question wasn't designed for answers. It was a calibration, a check-in with their own compass. From that day forward, the phrase began to circulate in mission briefings, scribbled in notebooks, posted near control panels. Not a slogan, a reminder. As the facility shifted into its next cycle of training and readiness, Bernard resumed his regular duties in the cafeteria. He continued to chop vegetables, portion rations, sweep floors. But now, officers and trainees often lingered longer by the counter, asking his opinion on things outside of food. He never overstepped, he never played expert. He just asked questions. When asked about the ethics of using neural stimulants in simulated environments, he simply replied, "Do they help your team recover faster, or just mask the fatigue?" When someone mentioned shortening sleep cycles to maximize prep time, he answered, "How long before your decisions start losing integrity?" He didn't pose these as criticisms, only curiosities. And yet, the effect was undeniable. One evening, Harrow returned from an external briefing with top command and sought Bernard out. She told him that the Eastern Complex had been selected as the lead training model for human integrated operations across the Continental Fleet. The reforms, the new doctrines, the cultural recalibrations, all of it had become a case study. Bernard raised his eyebrows at that. He didn't feel like a case study. He felt like a guy who got caught in the wrong room at the right time. But Harrow disagreed. She told him that systems evolve in sudden bursts, not always from inside the machine but from friction against it. And Bernard had become that friction. When he asked if that meant he was now part of the machine, she smiled and said, "No, you're the soul we forgot we needed." He didn't know what to say to that. So he did what he always did when words failed. He went back to the kitchen and started washing dishes. And as the hot water ran over his hands, and the hum of voices echoed from the dining hall, he realized that something irreversible had shifted. Not just in the facility, not just in the chain of command, but in himself. The hush that followed aboard the Resolute felt less like silence and more like collective breath being held, stretched taut across the command bridge and every corner of the fleet's operations. They were floating in the void between what had just been chaos, terror, unraveling authority, and what was now becoming a slow but certain coherence, led not by stars on shoulders, but by a cafeteria worker whose name had only been known by the mess staff, and a handful of sailors who liked to joke around near the kitchen hatch. Now Tessa Monroe's voice was echoing across the comms with the cadence of someone born not just to survive pressure, but to give it structure. Admiral Vance stood behind her, no longer shouting but absorbing. A man who had once commanded oceans and now watched a woman half his rank and far outside the chain of command recalibrate the entire fleet like a mechanic fixing a watch. And Tessa, for her part, wasn't thinking about legacy or recognition or history. She was thinking of the coordinates she'd plotted, the velocity of the debris fields, the chain reaction brewing in the backline reactors of Ship 9, and the fact that if her estimated margin of error was even 2% off, 26,000 souls could be scattered across Sector Thalos like dust from a broken jar. She gave commands like she gave recipes, step by step, each one necessary, none rushed, each informed by observation and necessity, not panic or hierarchy. What surprised everyone wasn't just that she was being obeyed, it was that her orders made sense. Suddenly, teams that had been frozen in indecision were springing into action. Harry, tech officers began to trust their screens again. Pilots stopped double-checking every directive and started trusting the flow of instruction. A pattern emerged from the chaos, and at its heart was the woman who used to serve soup and cornbread in the second galley. Lieutenant Commander Ruiz, now reassigned by his own choice to support Tessa directly, acted like a conductor's assistant, translating her strategies into briefings that the bridge staff could disseminate to the far reaches of the formation. With Tessa orchestrating responses in real time, they enacted a full backline rotation of the damaged freighters, repositioned the med ships to intercept incoming wounded, and recalibrated the propulsion grid for the Resolute itself to compensate for drift errors that had been threatening their planetary re-entry. In just under 40 minutes, the tide of failure turned, not without cost. Ships had been lost, lives with them, but no longer all of them, no longer needlessly. And as the last critical maneuver was executed, a tethering of the damaged cruiser Hartford to the stabilizer mooring of the Resolute, a feat that required precise timing and trust in Tessa's guidance, there was a visible release of tension. Like everyone aboard realized they had lived through the part of the story that would one day begin with, "There was a moment we thought it was all over," and then Admiral Vance, ever the stoic architect of command, walked slowly to the intercom. He opened the fleet-wide channel with a deliberate hand, his thumb trembling just slightly as he pressed the old analog button that connected his voice to the entire command. "All ships, this is Admiral Vance." The silence that followed his voice was immediate and total. Even those pulling debris off access points or sealing off coolant leaks paused. "We've avoided total disaster today not because of protocol and not because of command structure, but because someone who was never supposed to be on this bridge used everything she had, everything she learned, everything she noticed, everything she believed, to do what none of us could." Miss Tessa Monroe acted with clarity, precision, and an understanding of this fleet's needs in the middle of our darkest hour. That's leadership. That's courage. And if anyone has a problem with her being where she is right now, you'll have to go through me. And with that, he stepped aside and gave her the mic. For a moment, she hesitated. Not because she was afraid, but because she was still calculating. Still scanning her internal map of where everything was, what needed to be done next, what lives were still hanging by threads. She took the mic, and in the kind of voice that held not the confidence of ego but of clarity, she said, "We have a lot more to do. The systems are fragile. The damage isn't done unraveling yet. But we've bought time. That's enough. For now, thank you everyone for trusting a stranger in your ear." The mic clicked off. No one applauded. No one had to. There was a kind of reverence in the silence that followed. Acknowledgement not born of ceremony, but of recognition. People went back to work. Not because they were ordered to, because they wanted to help finish what she'd started. Hours later, in the temporary triage bay, surrounded by technicians and survivors, Tessa finally let herself exhale. Not just from this battle, but from the life she thought she'd be living forever. One behind steam tables and trays. One where she watched others lead and wondered what it would take to be taken seriously. Now, she didn't need to wonder. She had walked through fire, and in the heart of command, she hadn't melted. She had forged something, not just survival, but a new way forward. As dawn broke over the ocean horizon, casting golden streaks across the rippling water and metallic surface of the fleet, the events of the previous night began to settle into collective memory, not just as a thrilling tale of averted disaster, but as something deeper, something that would shift the culture of naval command for generations. On the USS Orpheus, there was a hush over the usual bustle of the early morning. Crews moved with quiet reverence through the halls, not out of fear or tension, but out of awe, awareness that they had witnessed history being made in the unlikeliest way imaginable. Rumors had already begun to swirl across nearby vessels, carried via encrypted but personal comms, about a cafeteria worker who had broken protocol, seized control in a moment of chaos, and led a team of officers and engineers to neutralize what could have been the most catastrophic intelligence breach in naval history. Chaos. But those who had been there, those who had seen Alex stand tall in the command center, drenched in sweat but unwavering, knew this wasn't fiction. It was legacy in motion. The Admiral's condition had stabilized, though he would remain under medical observation for several weeks. Rear Admiral Holt had recovered from his mental break, expressing deep regret for how events had spiraled under his command. It was later discovered through classified debriefings that Holt had been under silent investigation for months, suspected of mental health issues, but protected by a layer of seniority and favoritism that allowed him to evade thorough evaluation. The truth of that systemic failure was now coming to light in high places. But for Alex, none of that mattered as much as what he had seen with his own eyes. How easily a structure could crumble when it leaned too heavily on titles, when it failed to recognize the human capacity for leadership outside of rank. Alex stood once more in the ship's mess hall, but today he wasn't wearing his usual uniform. Commander Dana had ordered a new one delivered, a temporary service uniform with a placeholder insignia. It wasn't about military correctness. It was about symbolic recognition. The crew gathered silently, lining the perimeter of the room, waiting. In the center, Vice Admiral Reyes, who had arrived aboard a smaller vessel in the early hours of the morning, stood with folded hands and a solemn expression. Reyes had read every report, viewed every second of recorded footage, and conducted brief interviews with every high-level officer involved. There was no doubt in his mind what had taken place. The entire fleet had been on the brink, and it had been a civilian, a cafeteria worker with no tactical training, who had read the pulse of the moment, calculated the risk, and made the decision nobody else could. The Vice Admiral stepped forward and asked Alex to stand before him. The hall was still, save for the soft hum of the engines and the distant gulls echoing outside the steel walls. With deliberate care, Reyes pinned a temporary commendation medal to Alex's chest, an honor reserved for acts of valor that prevented catastrophic mission failure under extraordinary conditions. He declared that while Alex's position would technically remain civilian, the Navy was offering him full sponsorship into officer training, with a direct pathway into fleet operations, should he choose it. There was no pressure, only an open door. Alex's eyes brimmed but didn't break. He saluted, not because he had to, but because it felt right. The entire room erupted into applause, not the kind that explodes from obligation or groupthink, but the slow, deliberate, soul-stirring kind that builds from a place of respect. The kind of applause that says, "We see you now." Later, in the quiet that followed, Alex sat alone on the lower deck, staring out through one of the few open viewports. The ocean stretched out endlessly before him, a canvas of possibility. In his hand was a folded letter, an offer from the Naval Intelligence Bureau, requesting his consultation on new emergency protocol designs. Apparently, his quick-thinking methods were already being studied. But what meant more to him was the stack of handwritten letters he had received from the ship's junior crew members. Dozens of them. Young men and women thanking him for showing that leadership could look different, that courage didn't require a title, and that in moments of crisis, sometimes the one person who steps forward from the margins can shift the entire arc of the story. In one note, a young radar technician wrote, "You reminded me that being unseen doesn't mean being incapable. Thank you for standing up when we were all frozen." That line stuck with him, not because it glorified what he had done, but because it captured exactly what had driven him to do it in the first place. He had spent years in silence, cooking meals, cleaning trays, scrubbing grease off stovetops, hidden in plain sight. And yet, in the most critical hour, it wasn't his job that defined him. It was his presence, his clarity, his ability to believe that, even if nobody else moved, he still could. Weeks later, back on land, Alex walked into the Naval Academy Training Center, not as a recruit seeking permission, but as a consultant, a speaker, and a symbol. He wasn't looking to become famous. He wasn't even sure he'd accept the Navy's offer, but he knew this. His voice now had reach, and he intended to use it to tell others like him, the overlooked, the underestimated, the invisible, that they too could lead, they too could change the outcome, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step forward when everyone else steps back. The story of the USS Orpheus would be told in training simulations, in leadership conferences, and whispered in late-night mess halls for years to come. But in every version, there would be one constant, a cafeteria worker who, when the Admiral shouted orders nobody could follow, chose not to follow at all, but to lead instead. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.